Hey everybody, Dr. Krista here with the American Posture Institute, and we have a great webinar today. You guys are going to love it. I just want to make sure, before we get started, let's make sure that the audio is working, that you guys can hear me. Can I get a Y in the text box if you guys can hear me? Just give me a Y, let me know that you can hear me. All right, we got Juliana on here, we got Sharmi. Also, let me know where you guys are coming in from. So we always have, hi Karen, hi Robert. Okay, good, you guys can hear. We always want to get that out of the way first. So we have, wow, tons of people joining in. So we have Karen, hi Robert, hi Bana, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, Amanda, Misty, Sharmi, Sharon, Evelyn, Johanna, Omar, Reba, Paul, Ole, Karen, Amanda again, Scott, Teresa Williams. All right, guys, Noelle, Haas. Hope everybody is having a wonderful, wonderful time. Misty from New Mexico. Yeah, let us know where you're listening in from. It looks like I can already see that we have a nice international group, which is really cool. We've got, yeah, Czech Republic, UK, New Mexico, Ontario, Canada, Kentucky. Very cool, guys. Hey, thanks for joining in. We're going to get started. Justine from Michigan. Hi, Justine. Hi, Nat. Susan from Johannesburg, all the way from South Africa. We've got Kevin from Ohio. We've got Pennsylvania in the house, Colombia, India. See, literally, you guys are from all over the place. This is so great. Now, we are going to have a blast on this webinar. My whole goal is to provide value to you in a way that's applicable to you and to your patients that you can implement right away. Estelle from Cape Town, New Jersey, Bournemouth, England. All kinds of good, great people joining us today. Okay, Australia. We always have some Aussies on. Thank you. Okay, good. Heather, you can hear? Perfect. Whenever we're doing a webinar, it's always good to make sure that we have everything working out before we dive into the material. So you guys signed up for a webinar on postural neurology. Now, I want you guys to type neurology or neuro, N-E-U-R-O, into the comment box if you're currently applying neurology into your practice. Well, I want to kind of understand our audience who I'm talking to today. Terry from South Carolina. Hi, Terry. Hope you're doing well. We got Paul from England. Great. So again, type neurology or neuro into the comment box if you guys are currently using neurology in your practice. Yeah, it looks like a lot of you guys are. I can see that here. Wonderful. Cool. So let's talk about today specifically the neurology of the posture system. Now, the reason that we want to talk about that is because at what point do we understand that understanding the brain is the most important aspect. The brain is the master controller center of the body. So it controls and coordinates every single thing that we do, every thought, every action, every movement that we do. And it also controls and coordinates our postural design, our upright postural design, so that we can resist gravity in an effective manner. Now, this is so important because if we're ignoring the brain or we're neglecting the importance of the neurology controlling the posture system, then our results are going to be minimal at best. So what I want to talk about today with the webinar is first understanding the neurology. We'll look at a brain model, then we'll look at some PowerPoint slides. Then we'll go through some clinical application material so that you can apply it with your patients. And then I want to talk to you about how to set up treatment plans in a way that setting up treatment plans so that you can create neuroplastic changes in the posture system. So we can actually stimulate changes in brain function so that our patients can hold their treatments longer. So if you guys have ever experienced in practice that, maybe you had a patient who wasn't responding quite as well as you were hoping, or maybe you've had another patient who responds instantly, but they don't seem to hold their treatment very long, meaning they come in and they say, I felt so good after my last treatment, but then a day later my neck was hurting again, or my back started hurting again, or my knee started hurting again. So when we understand how to stimulate the brain for changes in posture, instead of just looking at the end problem itself, then we understand how we can create changes in the brain, which will create long-term neuroplastic changes of the posture system. Sound good? Okay. Yeah, it looks like a lot of people are implementing neuro in their practices. That's excellent. Zach from Iowa. Hi, Zach. Thanks for joining in. Very cool, guys. Okay. So before we get started with the PowerPoint slides, let's actually take a look at a brain model. So when we talk about the brain model here, you can see that we have the lobes of the brain. So in the front of the brain, we have the frontal lobe. On the side of the brain, we have the parietal lobe. in the back, we have the occipital lobe, and over here we have the temporal lobe. Now, the main role of the frontal lobe is our humanistic characteristics. So, for example, our ability to make executive decisions as human beings, our ability to set goals, motivation, reading, writing, and arithmetic. All of this happens within the frontal lobe. Now, also within the frontal lobe, we have what's called the motor cortex. And the motor cortex is what initiates all fine motor movements and gross motor movements. So all motor movements are initiated in the motor cortex. And then here with the parietal lobe, so just posterior to the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is very important for visual spatial processing. So this is how we, hi Laurence, thanks for joining in from Switzerland. So the parietal lobe is for visual spatial processing. Now this is how we understand where our body is in space in relation to other objects, or direction. So how we get from point A to point B to point C is going to be understood in our parietal lobe. So understanding where our body is in space, as well as where items are in relation to us and other items. And then within the parietal lobe, we have what's called the sensory cortex. Now, the sensory cortex is important for understanding any perceptions of the body. So with the motor cortex within the frontal lobe, we have descending motor output, meaning motor signals are started in the brain and then they're sent down the spinal cord to the end organ, which is the muscle, to initiate the movement. Now, we also have ascending incoming information. So the incoming information comes from into the sensory cortex, and then the brain, specifically the parietal lobe, makes sense of the incoming information. And in the back of the brain here, we have the occipital lobe. So you guys you're watching a webinar right now. Now, if you can see what's happening with the webinar, then what you're seeing, and then your ability to process what you're seeing so that it makes sense, is done in the back of the brain called the occipital lobe. Now, also the temporal lobe is for auditory processing. So everything that we're talking about right now, everything that you can hear, your ability to make sense of what you're hearing, to hear for one, and then make sense of what you're hearing, happens within the temporal lobe, okay? So again, the frontal lobe is for the motor cortex as well as executive human decision making. The parietal lobe is for visual spatial processing and the sensory cortex. The occipital lobe in the back is for visual processing, and then the temporal lobe here on the side is for auditory processing. Now, in addition to that, we have the cerebelli, or the cerebellum, or for plural is going to be cerebelli. So the role of the cerebellum is to refine motor output for better accuracy, balance, and coordination. And then we have the brainstem here. So the brainstem, the role of the brainstem is primarily for vital control of our organs. So for example, your respiratory rate and your heartbeat. This is all controlled involuntarily by aspects of your brainstem. Now, what's also important about the brainstem is that the house of the cranial nerves initiate or originate within the brainstem. So 10 of your 12 cranial nerves have nuclei within the brainstem, okay? So that's a visual look at the anatomy of the brain. Now let's take a look at some PowerPoint slides. So let me just turn this on really quickly. You guys can see that here. So if we were to look at a visual representation of the neurology, then again, we see the frontal lobe here in yellow. We see the parietal lobe back here in red, the temporal lobe here on the side in orange, and then the occipital lobe in the back, which is going to be in the turquoise color. And then just inferior to the overall cerebrum, we have the cerebellum. And again, the cerebellum is for accuracy, balance, and coordination, and to refine our motor outputs. And the brainstem here also inferior to the cerebrum. So the brainstem is important for coordinating those life-sustaining functions for homeostasis, such as controlling hunger, such as controlling heart rate and controlling respiration. Okay, so let's talk about the sensory motor cortex. So again, the motor cortex is located right here in the frontal lobe, and the sensory cortex is located here in the parietal lobe. So the motor cortex is how we perform motor output, and the sensory cortex is how we make sense of incoming afferent information. Okay, so let's talk first about the motor cortex. So your motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe, and it's going to initiate voluntary movement contralaterally. So your left motor cortex will cause movement of the right side of your body, and your right motor cortex will cause movement of the left side of your body. Now, as that happens, we also have ipsilateral postural stabilization. So for example, my right motor cortex causes movement, voluntary movement on the left side of my body, but simultaneously it stabilizes the right side of my body. Now, in order to create a motor plan or a motor movement, then the motor cortex is going to communicate with multiple aspects of the brain to create that motor plan. So it's going to communicate with the basal ganglia, the premotor cortex, and the cerebellum. So these are the main parts that are going to work together to create a motor plan in order to execute the voluntary movement. Now, this can be anything from kicking a soccer ball in a soccer game, or just small movements such as reaching forward for a glass of water. Whatever the movement is, then it's going to work with the basal ganglia for the motor plan, the premotor cortex and the motor cortex, and then the cerebellum to refine that motor output. Now, the cerebellum plays an important role in terms of refining the motor output so you can hit your target and that you perform it with precision. So for example, if people have dysfunction of cerebellum, they tend to have a lot of jerkiness in their movements. They overshoot, meaning that they don't hit the target very accurately. So the cerebellum helps us refine that motor output. And then we have the sensory cortex. So again, the sensory cortex is located within your parietal lobe. Now, this is a central sensation of stimulation from the periphery. So if you have incoming afferent information, where does that go? It travels up from the body into the parietal lobe or to the sensory cortex. And this is going to help us understand spatial awareness of our body sense. So you have a couple of different ascending tracks. You have the dorsal columns for fine touch, for joint position, for vibration, and then you have the anterolateral system for pain and for temperature. So all incoming afferent information is sent to the sensory cortex for interpretation of what's happening within our world. Now, if you guys remember from neuroanatomy class, I'm sure you learned about the cortical maps. So the cortical maps are a representation of our body within our brain. So you have a motor map and you have a sensory map. Now, this is important because the pieces of your body that have the most movement, that have the most apprehension, that have the most stimulus, are going to have higher representation within your cortical maps. So you can see here on this example that there's a large representation of the mouth and the tongue. There's a large representation of the face, and there's a very large representation of the hands. Why is that? Because whenever we're talking or eating, we're utilizing our mouth, so we utilize these muscles quite often. We also have a lot of stimulus to the face and our hands. If you think about your hands, if you want to feel an object, what's the first thing that you do? Do you rub your arm on it, or do you grab it with your hands and feel it? You grab it with your hands. So understanding that there's larger representation for the parts of the brain that, the part of the body within the brain that we have the most utilization. Now, this is important because how do you apply this to your patient? So you're going, okay, great. I understand that I have cortical maps, but what does that mean to my patient? And how does this reflect upon somebody who has back pain, for example? So let's talk first if you had a wrist injury, just because there's more representation here in the hand. So if I had a wrist injury and I broke my wrist, now what would happen? I put a cast on it. So if I put a cast on my wrist and I wasn't moving my wrist very often, then there would be less stimulation from my wrist up to my sensory cortex representing my wrist. Now what would happen, because the brain gives resources to the most important aspects of the brain and of the body, then there would be larger representation in your cortical map of your fingers and your elbow, which are moving more often to make up for the fact that you have a cast around your wrist. So for example, when you take the cast off the wrist, you see atrophy of the muscles, but you also see less coordination of the joints and inability to perform, for example, handwriting quite as easily as you did before the wrist or the cast was put on the wrist. So after it's taken off, for rehabilitation purposes, if we want to make neuroplastic changes in the cortical map, for high cortical representation, for precision within the cortical map of the wrist, then we need to start stimulating the wrist a lot more. Because when it's stimulated, then the brain gives more reference and more resources to the wrist, meaning that you can stimulate it by doing exercises. You can stimulate it by doing therapy. You can stimulate it, by using posture tape or cold and warm, using ice, using heat. These are all stimuli of the wrist, which are represented in the map. Now also think about the back, for example. So I'm sure some of you guys have patients who have back problems, right? I know I'm not the only one. So with back problems, what happens is that, they come in and they say, I've had problems with my back for 10 years. So when they say this, what we understand is that if they've had this chronic pain pattern, then they've probably changed their posture and they've changed their gait around that chronic pain pattern. So with that chronic pain pattern, then if we want to re-stimulate it, if we want to have clarity with the cortical map, we need to do a strong amount of rehabilitation, specifically to the back where it has been injured, so that we can have that representation back within the cortical map for complete recovery. All right, so it looks like a couple of you guys are having issues with signing in and hearing and stuff. If you could just let me know, if you could give me a why, if you can see the slides and if you can hear me appropriately. I just want to make sure, because I want you guys to have this information. So just give me a why in the comment box if you can see okay and if you can hear me okay as well. Okay, cool. Great. So sometimes with live webinars, make sure that your internet is working really well, because I know a couple of you guys are having issues, but it looks like the majority of you, everything's totally fine. So we'll keep going. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the spine. So the spine is important for sensory motor integration. So sensory motor integration is basically that your spine is a freeway system of ascending information that's going from the body up to the brain and the sensory cortex, and descending information that's coming in from motor stimuli. So for example, if you want to make a motor movement, it starts in the motor cortex, travels down the spine, and then that information goes to the final organ, which is going to make the movement, such as the muscle. So your spine is so important because it protects the spinal cord for sensory motor integration. So integrating, if we have an incoming ascending afferent stimulus, then the brain makes sense of that sensory stimulus. It communicates with the motor cortex how to respond. So for example, if there's an unpleasant stimulus coming in, then that unpleasant stimulus is going to give an indication within your sensory cortex that this is unpleasant, that it's unwarranted, unwanted. And so the motor cortex, the motor response then would be to move away suddenly or to quickly retract. Whereas if from the sensory cortex we had a nice soothing experience or sensation, then we wouldn't need to move our hand away from that stimulus as we would a painful stimulus, for example. So understand that spine is for sensory motor integration. It's a freeway of ascending sensory information and descending motor output. And then next, with the neurology controlling the posture system, we have the visual system. Now the visual system is so important to posture because our visual system is how we orient ourselves within space. It's also how we have good head posture. So for example, if you think about orientation, I want you to think about this example. You know, wherever you're standing right now, or wherever you're sitting, think about where the exit is to that room. Now, if you had to go towards that exit and you can see it, it'd be no problem. You could just walk straight to that exit. Now imagine if you needed to find the exit of the room, but you had to close your eyes and find it. Now you would feel a little bit less oriented. Even if you knew that the exit, for example, was straight in front of you, you would feel a less orientation within the room, knowing precisely where that exit was. And you would probably change your posture pattern, meaning that you would, instead of having your hands by your side while you're walking, you would probably put your hands out in front of you so that you could feel with your hands to make up for the fact that you have less orientation because there's a dysfunction in the visual system because you cannot see. So you can understand then any change in visual function is going to have an impact on your posture patterning, most specifically with head posture. Now with head posture, one of our most humanistic characteristics is that we keep our eyes parallel to the horizon. So instead of being a quadruped like many other animals, we stand on 2 feet, we have a bipedal stance, we have an upright posture, and we keep our eyes parallel to the horizon as we move about our world. So our head posture then, for good orientation, keeps us grounded by keeping our feet on the ground, resisting our body upright against gravity, and then keeping our eyes parallel to the horizon so we can see in front of us, we can see around us, and then we can perform our movements as well. Now, the visual system works with the vestibular system with multiple different tracks. So for example, you have the medial longitudinal fasciculus, which is the MLF, a descending pathway that goes from the visual system and the vestibular system down to the cervical spine. So your visual system and your vestibular system have direct contact with the proprioception of your cervical spine. Now, if you have any visual dysfunction, it's going to show up as head posture distortion patterns. So let me give. Okay, so you guys can see me. So think about this. If you can't see very well, if you have decreased visual acuity, what do you tend to do? Do you squint forward and forward head posture? Okay, so I have less visual acuity, meaning that I bring my head forward in relation to my shoulders, resulting in the postural distortion pattern of forward head posture. Or if I have my two eyes here, but they can't go to midline, they cannot converge, both of them, then what happens? I develop a head tilt over time. So we compensate for any sort of visual dysfunction with the cervical spine or posture quadrant 1. Now another example is that if you have an eye dominance. So if you have an eye dominance and you see the world predominantly from one eye, what do you develop? A head rotation. So if we want to correct postural distortion patterns over time of the cervical spine, the head and the cervical spine, then we always have to address visual function, okay? So if you guys are currently working with the visual system with your patients, just type in visual within the comment box just to get an idea of if you guys are working with that visual system. Okay, we're gonna go back to the PowerPoint here. So the next aspect, yeah, some of you guys are working with the visual system. I can see that from your comments there. That's so good. Because if you want to get those long-term postural correction results, you have to address the neurology. And one of the key aspects of the neurology is that visual system. And then the next aspect that's really important is going to be the vestibular system. So the vestibular system then is important for equilibrium and upright extension. So equilibrium is postural stability and balance. It's your postural balance. So our ability to resist gravity and stay upright, meaning if we have a problem with equilibrium or a problem with our balance, what happens? We can fall over, we can have vertigo, we can have motion sickness. So when there's just dysfunction of the vestibular system, then we have poor postural balance, meaning we cannot resist gravity with utmost efficiency, leading to symptoms such as motion sickness or symptoms such as vertigo or symptoms such as feeling unbalanced or unstable. Now, in addition to that, the vestibular system controls upright extension of the posture system. So we extend to resist gravity. Now, this is going to be via the lateral vestibulospinal tract. So if you think about the name of that tract, vestibulospinal, it's the vestibular system going down to the spine. So vestibulospinal, meaning that you have a descending tract, the vestibulospinal tract, that descends to the thoracic spine to bring you into upright extension. So let me give you a visual of that. Yeah, so you guys can have that visual. So if we do not have good function of the vestibular system, then we go into flexion, a flexor position, or a postural hyperkyphosis. Whereas with the stimulation of the lateral vestibulospinal tract, then it brings our body here into upright extension so that we can resist gravity in an extended upright postural design. So I wanted you to have that visual cue so that when you think about the vestibular system, think about balance and equilibrium, but also think about upright extension against gravity. So with that vestibular system, we actually have receptors against gravity. And if there's a change in body position against gravity, then what the vestibular system does, it functions to bring us back central or bring us back into a balanced state. So the vestibular system is really important to postural design as well. So why don't you guys type vestibular in the comment box if you're working with the vestibular system. And then we'll go on to the next aspect that's really important of the neurology controlling the posture system, and this is called the pontomedullary reticular formation, or I'm going to call it the PMRF, just because it's a little bit shorter and easier to say. Yeah, it looks like some of you guys are working with vestibular patients already. That's awesome. So stimulating that vestibular system and working with the visual system is so important for good long-term results for postural correction. Good, yeah, I can see a lot of you guys responding. That's awesome. Okay, so the last aspect that I want to talk about is going to be the pontomedullary reticular formation, again, the PMRF. So the role of the PMRF is, well, first of all, where's the PMRF located? It's located within the brainstem. So within the brainstem, we have the pons and the medulla. Okay, the pons and the medulla. Now, where they come together and where they have a cluster of cranial nerve nuclei is called the pontomedullary reticular formation. So ponto means pons, medullary means medulla, and reticular formation is the cluster of cranial nerve nuclei. So it's going to be cranial nerves 5 through 12, which are located within the PMRF, those nuclei. Now, the roles of the PMRF that are important for us as posture professionals is that it inhibits flexion, for one. So I just talked to you a minute ago when I took it off the slide and I showed the video of me. When I have flexor dominance, it means that I'm going with gravity. I'm flexing forward into that postural hyperkyphosis position. So if postural hyperkyphosis is flexor dominant, what we want upright extension. However, if I'm not inhibiting flexion, then I'm going more and more into flexion. In addition to that, it inhibits the ipsilateral IML. So your IML is going to be your sympathetic nervous system, meaning that, Gail's saying that she can't, lose voice and miss parts of what you say. Is anybody else having any issues with the audio, or are we still doing okay? Give me a Y if you're still okay with audio. Okay. So inhibition of ipsilateral IML, meaning that with the inhibition, looks like you guys are doing good. Okay, great. So it's important that you guys can hear, so that's why I'm just checking as we go. So inhibition of IML means that you're going to inhibit the sympathetic nervous system. So if there is dysfunction of the PMRF, then you have there is an increased stimulus of the sympathetic nervous system, meaning there's more of a fight or flight response. And then also, when the PMRF is functioning well, you have inhibition of pain. So we love the PMRF from a professional perspective because when the PMRF is functioning well, we have inhibition of flexion, meaning we have better posture. We have inhibition of IML, which means that we have decreased sympathetic tone, and we have inhibition of pain. Okay, all right. So when you look at the brainstem, now I wanted to show you this exactly because the PMRF is so important to posture professionals because when it's functioning properly, we inhibit flexion. So with an inhibition of flexion, here's what happens if we're not inhibiting flexion. We go into a postural hyperkyphosis, which you can also see on this image here, the rounding of the thoracic spine. So if I'm not inhibiting flexion, I'm here in this position, a postural hyperkyphosis. When I am inhibiting flexion, then I'm here in an upright extended position. So when there's dysfunction of the PMRF, I'm not inhibiting gravity. I'm not inhibiting flexor dominance. Now, in addition to that, I have more stress and sympathetic output. Now, also, if it's dysfunctional, the PMRF is not functioning properly, then I also have more pain. So then we know, as posture professionals, if our patients have better posture, then they're going to have less pain and less sympathetic output. So that's a jackpot for us as we're working with our patients because we want them so badly to have better posture, but it's not just so that they look better, but it's also so that they feel better and that they function better too. All right, let's go back to this. Hyperkyphosis. Now you can see with the postural hyperkyphosis, this is an example of good posture here. Whereas with a kyphosis, then you see that C-shaped spinal curvature. You can see anterior rolling of the shoulders, forward head posture, loss of height. So you're actually shorter in this position because you're rolled forward. And there's a kyphotic curve and then a lordotic curve of the lumbar spine. So an important distinction to make is the difference between a postural hyperkyphosis and a structural hyperkyphosis. So structural hyperkyphosis is going to be due to a structural change. So for example, if you have a collapsed vertebra, an extra vertebra, if you have a change that you can visibly see on X-ray, then that's going to be a change in the structure causing a structural hyperkyphosis. Whereas with a postural hyperkyphosis, I know you guys see this all the time in your practice, you're going to see the patient who has the ability of sitting up straight. So for example, you say, can you sit up straight? And instantly they sit up straight. But then maybe you look 5 minutes later and they're back to that slumped position. They're back to the C-shaped spinal curvature that you can see here. Now with that C-shaped spinal curvature, it's not that they have a structural deformity, it's just that they lack postural fitness to maintain upright postural design. So what we want to do from a postural perspective is we want to correct that so that they can have good upright posture. And we'll show you how to do that with postural neurology. Okay, so how does the brain create dynamic movement? So from a dynamic motor movement that's voluntary, that motor plan is going to start in the basal ganglia and the motor cortex. Now the motor cortex sends the information down the brainstem, crosses over, and then down the spinal cord to the skeletal muscle. So it's going to be contralateral, meaning that the left motor cortex controls movement of the right hand, or the right side of the body, and the left motor cortex controls movement of the right side of the body. So what happens if we perform a movement? So if I want to reach forward with my right hand to grab a glass of water, or if I want to kick with my left foot. So think about that. Think of a soccer player that they're going in for a big kick. So they want to kick with their left foot. What do you need to do to the opposite side of the body? You need to stabilize it upright. Because if you didn't, then you would risk falling over or completely missing the ball when you try to go into that kick, or when you try and reach forward to grab a glass of water. So if you want to kick with your left foot, that's going to be, if you kick with your left foot, that's going to be a right motor cortex controlling that voluntary movement. Now to stabilize my body, that's going to be ipsilateral. So postural stabilization happens ipsilaterally, meaning that it goes from the the frontal lobe, the motor cortex, down to the brainstem, the spinal cord, and postural muscles on the same side of the body. Now this is important for us because if we do not posturally stabilize, let's think about this example. I'm going in for a kick with my left foot. Now, as I go for a kick, then I need to stand on my right leg, okay? So I need to posturally stabilize in order to make that voluntary movement of a kick. If I want to reach forward with my right hand, my left motor cortex controls that voluntary movement. But if I did not posturally stabilize this side of my body, then I would just collapse forward. So we have to have, with our voluntary movements, we also need to have ipsilateral postural stabilization to ensure that we have accuracy of our movements. Now, why does this matter to our patients? So have any of you ever had the patient who says, I bent over to put my socks on and then my back went out? Meaning that they went into a forward flexor position and then they did not posturally stabilize correctly, so they collapsed and their back went out. I want you to just type Y in the comments if you've had a patient who said this before. That they bent forward to pick something up, maybe it was just a pencil, for example, or they bent forward to put their socks on or put their shoes on, but they go forward into this flexor position with a voluntary movement. So the voluntary movement is putting my shoes on, or the voluntary movement is grabbing a pen off the ground. But what I didn't do as I made this voluntary movement was I didn't posturally stabilize accurately. So I collapsed. I went into a collapsed position, and that's where the injury occurred. So I bring this up because it's really important for our patients. We understand that if they have this postural distortion patterns, then it can create a collapse, postural collapse. And if we don't have the postural fitness to maintain it, maintain upright postural design, then we're going to, it's going to lead us down a path of potential injury or just collapsed posture when we're trying to perform these voluntary movements. So postural stabilization then is really important. Now, also think about that, like if you work with athletes specifically, a lot of people just focus on the end movement of the athlete. So if I'm playing golf, for example, then they'll work on the golf swing. Or if I play tennis, then they work on the tennis serve. But what we also need to work on is not just the movement of the serve itself, but how we stabilize our body while performing that movement. Because if I can't stabilize, then I could trip and fall, or I could go into a collapsed position while I perform that movement of the serve. So in addition to thinking about the final movement itself and working with an athlete, also think about their postural stabilization while performing that movement. Does that make sense? I hope it does, because that's an important concept that a lot of practitioners are missing when they're working with athletes. Is postural decline a brain problem or a spine problem? Okay, so ask yourself, is it a brain problem or a spine problem? Now, I would say that it's a brain problem that we see in the spine. So if we want to correct it, then we need to correct the spine to stimulate the brain for long-term postural flexion changes. Okay, so in order to make this happen, then postural neurology is the perfect solution. So postural neurology is a solution, and what we want to do is a three-step plan here. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to ensure proper visual function for better head posture. So I gave you the example, if, for example, you have decreased visual acuity, then you go into a forward head posture. If you can't converge your eyes, you go into a head tilt, or if you have an eye dominance, you go into a head rotation. So to ensure proper visual function helps us have better head posture and prevent, for example, a head tilt, head rotation, or forward head posture. And then step number 2 is to restore flexor-extensor synergy to reverse postural hyperkyphosis and have proper postural stabilization. So let's talk about that one for a second. So I'm actually going to just turn this back. Extensor tone or flexor-extensor synergy looks like this. So if I have decreased flexor-extensor synergy, then I go into a flexor-dominant position here. Okay, the gravity's pulling down on my body. So I'm flexor-dominant. However, if I inhibit flexion and I stimulate extension, then I go from here, postural hyperkyphosis, to here with a nice upright postural positioning. So again, if I'm not inhibiting flexion and I'm not stimulating extension, I'm in this position with a slumped, forward head posture and slumped forward shoulders. Whereas if I restore the flexor-extensor synergy, then I'm creating extension and I'm inhibiting flexion. So that's our goal. We want to recreate that flexor-extensor synergy. All right, let's go back to the PowerPoint. I know I'm switching back and forth. There's number 1, ensure proper visual function for better head posture. Number 2, restore flexor-extensor synergy to reverse postural hyperkyphosis. And number 3, set up treatment plans for neuroplasticity of the cortical maps. So Zach has to go see some patients. Zach, good luck working with your patients the rest of the afternoon. Thanks for joining us. And Kim says, please pause your speaking while you switch from slides. Okay, I can do that. So now it's caught up with the slide coming up with the postural neurology solution. So let's just review that in case it cut out at all. So ensure proper visual function for better head posture. Number 2, restore flexor-extensor synergy. And then number 3 is set up treatment plans for neuroplasticity of the cortical maps. So with the cortical maps, we talked about before that if you have a postural distortion pattern or if you have chronic pain in a certain area, then it's within the brain that we need to rehabilitate it. We need to move it. We need to create neuroplasticity of our brain within that area. So if you have low back pain, then we need to stimulate that part, for example, the SI joint. We need to stimulate the SI joint on that side of the back to reiterate and create clarity within the cortical map. So this is our 3-step solution that you'll learn how to do with postural neurology. Okay, so let me go through these couple of slides and then we'll switch it back so that I can show it to you as well. So for the visual system, which was number 1, to make sure that we have proper head positioning or head posture, what I want you to do is check for convergence and divergence. So you can see in this picture here that you're going to bring a pen. It's going to start, about a foot or so away from your face, and then you'll slowly bring it in. And what you want to see is that the eyes converge together at midline. So both eyes should come together. So this is an example of proper convergence, meaning that both eyes are pointed toward the nose. They're pointed in medially. Now, what we do not want to see is a divergent eye, as we can see right here. So you can see that this eye is towards the nose, but this eye did not go medial. Now, if this happens, then it can lead to decreased range of motion of cervical spine, as well as head posture distortion patterns. So let me show you. Okay, so check for the divergent eye. Now, in addition to that, as you perform this, when you bring the pen in, I want you to check for endurance as well. So not only can they bring their eye to midline, but are they able to hold it? Okay, so hold it for 5 to 10 seconds to see if they can maintain their eyes in this position. Now also check for postural changes as they do it. So if I bring the pen into my nose and I'm trying to, but you see a head rotation or a head tilt, then this is going to be a positive test that they're having dysfunction while they do it. So let me show you what this looks like. Okay. I'm going to pause for just a minute, make sure that the screen and the audio is catching up. Okay, you guys should be able to hear this. So you can utilize a pen or you can utilize your finger. And what you're going to do to the patient is this. You're going to start with the pen or the finger out here. You're going to slowly bring it into midline. Now what you're watching for is their ability to bring their eyes to midline, just like this. Okay, here, you watch the eyes converge towards midline. If you see a divergent eye, that is going to be the weak eye, okay? So again, you bring it here and you hold for 5 to 10 seconds to check the endurance to see if they can hold that convergence. Or you also checking their posture while they do it. So if I'm trying to bring my eyes together and I go into a head tilt, then that's a demonstration that I'm utilizing my head posture to compensate for a visual dysfunction. Does that make sense? So you want to watch for the position of the body while performing the activity with a check. So if you see a divergent eye, take note of which eye is divergent so that we can correct it with an exercise. So then the corrective exercise is going to be small eye circles. So if I want to bring this eye into midline, what I'm going to do is small eye circles to stimulate it and move the eyes with my finger to watch this. Okay, so for example, watch this. So if I perform eye circles, then it's creating convergence of my eyes, and I'm following that stimulus. Okay, so I perform this for about 30 seconds. And then afterwards, you can retest to see how their convergence is again. So again, if this eye was divergent, I want to bring it this way. So I'm going to perform the small eye circles in front of the opposite eye. If this eye was divergent, then I want to perform eye circles over here so that this eye comes in midline. Because if I perform the circles over here, you can see that this eye is looking at the midline in order to watch my finger as it circles around. Okay? So this is going to be a great application that you can do with your patients, especially your patients who still have forward head posture, still have a head tilt, or maybe they still have neck pain after you've treated them a few times in practice. So go ahead and implement this with them in order to stimulate visual function for better head posture position. All right, we're going to switch back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so now let's talk about extension exercises. So step number 2 of our postural neurology solution is to restore flexor-extensor synergy. So if we want to inhibit flexor dominance, then we want to stimulate extension. So you can see this exercise that I'm doing here in the picture. It's just a Superman exercise. So as I'm laying over the ball, I have my feet grounded into the floor, and then I bring my body back into extension. So as I bring the body back into extension, I'm holding that position for a minimum of 10 seconds. Now, the last thing that I want to do is really quick repetitions where I barely hold the extension. The whole point is to bring the body into a nice extended position, hold that position, and then rest and perform again. This is going to help me build postural fitness so that I can maintain upright extension via stimulation of the vestibular system and the PMRF for better function, so that we can have better restoration of flexor and extensor synergy. Okay, now the next thing, in addition to doing Superman exercises to bring the body into extension, I also want you to think about your patient sitting on posture cushions and performing posture breaks. So you can see that I'm sitting on a posture cushion here in this example. So the cushion, it helps me stay in an upright extended postural positioning. Why is that? It helps because it's an unstable surface, meaning that with an unstable surface, then I risk the chance of falling over. So if I were to sit in a normal chair, then I can sit in a slumped posture and I wouldn't fall out of it. Whereas if I sit on an unstable surface, which is a posture cushion or an exercise ball, it's the same concept, then I need to have upright posture position and utilize and engage my core musculature and utilize the receptors of my vestibular system to stay upright against gravity. So I highly recommend sitting on a posture cushion because it engages your vestibular system and your posture system throughout the day to again restore that flexor extensor synergy. Now, in addition to that, taking a posture break. So we tend to go into, Dr. Scott's going to go see a patient. Dr. Scott, thanks for joining us. A posture break is when we're seated, a lot of our patients tend to go into that flexor dominant position. So if you take a posture break for 30 seconds every hour, then it's going to stimulate upright posture to inhibit flexor tone again. So I'm going to switch back and just give you a demonstration of what Okay, cool. So what does a posture break look like? Now I'm standing, you can do the standing, but definitely have your patients do it while they're seated. So if they're seated, especially for hours and hours per day, every hour for 30 seconds, I want them to take a posture break. So what this looks like is instead of going into this position where I'm flexor dominant and I'm going down with gravity, what I'm going to do is go anti-gravity. So I'm going to bring my hands out to the side, roll my shoulders back, hold my chin back, and drop my head back, and my chest goes forward. I'm going to hold this position for 30 seconds. Now, if you guys try it right now with me, you can actually feel it. You can feel that you're opening up the rib cage, that you're opening up the thorax. So instead of being here in a slumped position, you're going anti-gravity, pushing the chest forward, bringing the head back, and bringing the arms back. Now, after you perform this, you're going to notice a couple things. You're going to notice that you're more engaged and you're more upright. So these are very fantastic. For postural habit reeducation, this is one of the best recommendations that you can make to your patients. So again, performing a posture break for 30 seconds every single hour. And that's to reverse flexor dominance, or a slumped position, also called a postural hyperkyphosis. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. All right, now the last thing, number 3, for our postural neurology solution is to create treatment plans that stimulate neuroplasticity. So we're not interested in just getting our patient out of pain in that moment. What we want to do is keep them out of pain and change their posture long term. We want to get long-term results. So if you want to get long-term results, then you need to target the brain in order to do so. So to set up your treatment plan in a way that stimulates neuroplasticity, I want you to think about these considerations. So high frequency of visits initially. So when you first start seeing a patient, you want to see them a lot in the initial stages so that you can actually make changes in the brain. Also think low repetition but high complexity of exercises. So instead of doing 30 bicep curls, what you want to do is you want to do high complexity exercises that are going to stimulate the motor and the sensory cortex. And then you want to hold the contraction for 10 to 30 seconds. So instead of just doing, again, fast repetitions, you want to hold the contraction of the muscle. And then also you want the patient to be very focused and motivated and mindful during the rehabilitation, meaning that you don't want them just sitting there thinking about a million other things while they're doing the rehabilitation. In order to stimulate neuroplasticity, the brain needs to focus on the activity at hand. So the patient should actually look at their muscle and feel the muscle contraction and be very mindful of what's happening within their body. Be mindful of good posture presentation. And then the last is phases of exercise progressions. The last thing that you want with the treatment plan is that we do the same thing for a 12-week period. You want to always stimulate changes within the phases to stimulate more complexity to the brain. So this is a sample treatment plan for a brain-based postural correction protocol. So phase number 1 is going to be high frequency of care. So 4 to 5 times per week for the first couple of weeks. That would be phase 1. So you're doing in-office rehabilitation, manual therapy, as well as the patient doing at-home rehabilitation. And then phase 2, approximately 6 weeks. And this is just an example. This isn't for every single patient, but this is going to be for like a standard patient. So for phase 2, for 6 weeks, you'd see the patient 2 times per week, do 2 manual therapies per week. And when they do their at-home rehabilitation, they're actually doing it 5 times per day. And then phase 3, once for a month, would be 1 time per week in office and 5 times per day with that brain-based postural correction. So you really, in order to make neuroplastic changes, if you want to actually change the patient's brain, you need to see them at high frequency at the beginning, less so as they go on throughout their treatment plan, and they need to be stimulating their brain throughout the day. So when you set up your at-home rehabilitation, it's not about doing an hour of rehabilitation in one setting. It's about doing 10 minutes of rehabilitation 5 times per day. Does that make sense? So this is an example of what you could have the patient do for the vestibular function. So you always want to have them changing their exercise. You don't want them to get to that plateau phase. So if you do 1 leg balance, then you would do 1 set, 1 repetition, and hold that for 30 seconds. And do that 5 times per day. Once the patient can do 1 leg balance, then challenge them. Instead of having them plateau where they can just perform the exercise, bring them to the next level or the next step, and that's going to be 1 leg balance with eyes closed. So once they can do that for 30 seconds, 5 times per day, then have them do 1 leg balance on an unstable surface that you can see here, okay? So that's an example of a progression that you could do with your patient up and the picture catches up? Okay, so that's an example of a treatment plan that you could utilize with your patients to stimulate neuroplasticity or neuroplastic changes of the posture system. Now, the reason I bring all this together is if we understand the neurology controlling the posture system, then we move from being just pain specialists into getting our patient out of pain, but also correcting their posture long term so that we can help prevent more painful patterns moving forward. This is going to differentiate you from the practitioner down the road, where the patient says, hey doc, my shoulder hurts here. So that practitioner goes straight to where the pain is instead of understanding the brain-body connection and stimulating the brain in order to have better control or better motor output and better sensation of that shoulder. So what we understand from brain-based postural corrections is that better inputs create better outputs. So if I have good inputs into the system, then I create better, more precise motor outputs. So when you're working with athletes, again, going back to that example, the inputs that you put into the body to stimulate great postural stabilization is going to help them have better outputs of their posture system. And when you set up your treatment plans, when you want to change head posture, never forget about the importance of the visual system. When you want to reverse postural hypokyphosis, which is the most common presentation, why is it? Because we look down at our cell phone all the time in this position. If you want to reverse that, focus on restoring flexor-extensor synergy to inhibit flexion and stimulate upright extension. And then when you set up that treatment plan, set it up in a way that stimulates neuroplasticity to actually make changes within the brain. And you can do that by seeing the patient often at the beginning and having them hold their contractions longer instead of performing high repetitions. Perform the movement, hold, think about it, be very mindful of what you're doing, and then you can create those neuroplastic changes. Also, always think of it being a stair-step progression. So instead of having the patient get to the point where they can do an exercise and then they plateau, always give them the next level. Give them the next level of complexity. Your brain craves complexity. And when the brain is performing complex activities such as puzzles and complex movements, the brain really pays attention and it learns and it creates new motor patterns. So always think about how you can stimulate neuroplasticity. So take it away from just being all about pain to get the patient out of pain, but also create neuroplasticity of their brain to have better long-term postural correction changes and prevent that pain from coming back. All right, guys, postural neurology is a lot of fun. When you understand the brain, you stop guessing and you start knowing. So to keep the conversation going, we have a couple more webinars that are coming up. In addition to that, if you want to join us for ongoing conversations and free live trainings, then I encourage each of you to join the Facebook group, which is called Postural Neurology. I'm just going to type that in the comments here so you can see it. So when you go to Facebook, all you need to do is type in Postural Neurology. I'll actually pull up the exact link for you. And then you can join that group. It's for free, and we have all kinds of ongoing trainings just for you guys. I'm going over to the Facebook group. Now, in the meantime, as I'm pulling up that link for the Postural Neurology Facebook group, I want to open it up for questions as well. So let me know if you have any questions. Go ahead and type those in the comment box below, and we will get that all set up for you. Okay, here's the link to the Postural Neurology Facebook group. And then I want to hear your questions so I can make sure that I get those answered for you. All right, Amanda says, that was awesome. Thank you, Amanda, for joining us. You're awesome as well. Irita, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. That was a beautiful, beautiful name. Thank you. It's really interesting. Can't wait for the next webinar. You're very welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to uplevel your knowledge and education with the American Posture Institute. Misty says, muscle-mind connection. Absolutely. Gerard, Postural Neurology. Laurence, thank you. Thank you, Laurence, for joining us. Do you have any material to read? So what I would say, Irita, is just join us in the Facebook group. There's tons of material for you to read in the Facebook group. So for example, I'm always posting free guides. We do more free trainings. Plus, in addition to that, we have a lot of articles that go out in that Postural Neurology Facebook group. Thank you for the interesting webinar. You're so welcome. Can you see the dynamic move slide again? I'll pull that up in just a second. David, is the convergence test your main visual test that you use? David, that's a great question. That's one of the multiple that we do. So we check convergence with a lot of patients. The reason we check it is because so many patients have convergence dysfunction. But in addition to that, on a complete brain-based analysis, we're going to check for visual acuity. We're going to check for smooth pursuits. We're going to check for gaze stabilization. We're going to check saccades in addition to convergence. So all of the, also pupillary reflex. So we're going to check all of these things on a brain-based posture analysis. Great question. All right, trying to keep up with questions. Abraham, thank you. Steve, thanks, good stuff. Steve, thank you for joining us. Okay, that's a great question. How can you incorporate this for special needs kids? So if you're working with special needs kids, I would say that you really can't afford not to implement this information. So it's going to probably take you a little bit longer to perform the corrections. But if you see a special needs kid in this posture, for example, have them do Superman exercises and posture breaks every hour. You may need mom and dad to remind them to perform these, but make sure that you start working with their posture system and stimulating upright posture extension. Also with special needs kids, really focus on balance with the posture system. So for postural stability, you want them working the vestibular system by doing balance training as well, really important. Also, you're going to see a lot of that visual dysfunction with special needs kids as well. Sometimes, for example, if you have a child who can't read very well, half the time it's not because they can't process the information, it's just that they can't see very well. So address the visual system, address the vestibular system and the PMR rep for better upright posture functioning. All right, Gerard says, we're watching you in class and we have all of your tools. My class is having fun. Oh, good, I'm glad you guys are having fun, Gerard. Yvette says, thank you, a great approach to patient-centered treatment. Perfect, thank you for joining, Yvette. Karen, thank you. Great, Karen's gonna use some of this today. So what I love about what Karen said is I'm gonna use this today. So knowledge is power if you utilize it. Having knowledge is not powerful. The implementation of the knowledge that you learn is what's really powerful. So the moment that you utilize this with your patients, that's how you're going to make those transformational changes. Lance, thank you to you. Nancy, thank you. Carlos, thank you to you. Dr. Scott, excellent and simplistic. Good. And great reminders. Do you work with any of the Pettibon weighting system? So Scott, I really hope this was simplistic because I think a lot of people have the misinterpretation in neurology that it has to be really complex. It has to take hours of your time per patient. If you implement these small analyses and corrections with the vestibular system and the visual system, it's going to help you get better results instantaneously. With that being said, for forward head posture, we definitely recommend using head weights. So he's referring to the weighting system. So if the patient has forward head posture, what you can have them do is wear a posture headband that has anterior weights. And it's going to help retract the cervical spine via the righting reflex. So one of the at-home rehabilitations that we have our patients do is the utilization of head weights. Great question. Thank you. Okay, cerebral palsy, more specific motor function malfunction. I'd love to have some ideas and tips. Okay, so cerebral palsy, I want you to think about balance. I want you to think about how you can help them with gait patterns. So with cerebral palsy, it's going to be really complex, and that's going to be a change in motor function. So think about how you can have small wins for the patient in a way that they can have better movement patterns that allow them to function within their world. So they're not trying to refine motor output for kicking the soccer ball necessarily, it's more walking straight. So for walking straight, help them with their gait patterns. If you see rigidity, which is very, very common for cerebral palsy, then I want you to work with passive mobilization. So either joint manipulation or just moving the muscles and the joints in that position via passive movement, because they may be so stiff that they need mobilization. So think about mobilization. Also, definitely 100% work with balance training. If they can balance their body upright against gravity, imagine the amount of anxiety and depression that you can take away from them because they're not worried about falling over. If they can walk straight, if they can hold their body upright against gravity, you've just added so much to their quality of life. Now, also, in addition to that, if you can help them have better visual function, they're going to be able to concentrate even better. Okay. Ali says, thank you. Time to catch up on the review. Ross, great webinar. Thanks for joining, Ross. Okay. Paul, any recommended textbooks? So there's, for recommended textbooks, there's a lot out there. Like, I'm trying to think, what's the name of the visual text that I like? I think it's called The Neurology of Eye Movements. That's a really good text that you can read for the visual system. And then there's a textbook on the vestibular system. I think it's just called The Vestibular System. So just Google those and you'll find the top textbooks in those. Thanks, thank you. Can you send this technique to Parkinson's? Can you use this technique with Parkinson's? So that's another good question. Can you use this technique with Parkinson's? So we had a question about cerebral palsy. We had a question about Parkinson's. Now, understanding when we're working with the patient, we're working with their neurology, we're working with their body or the posture system. So you can apply these concepts to all types of patients. But here's the thing, is that you need to recognize that when you're working with certain patients or special needs kids, somebody else asked about that, it may take longer for you to perform the analyses and it may take longer for them to get results, but you can absolutely 100% apply these same concepts to cerebral palsy, special needs, and Parkinson's patients. Vanessa says, thank you. Yvette says, excellent. Lay says, do you have any posters available somewhere? So the posters behind me you can actually buy on our website, AmericanPostureInstitute.com. Kevin, I have a special needs patient coming in 5 minutes, and I'll be using this. Great. Kevin, be sure to let us know in the Facebook group how it goes. Monica, are there people that don't have a dominant eye? So Monica, that's a great question. It is very, very common to have a dominant eye. What I recommend doing is if there's a very significant dominance and if it's creating a head rotation, you can just patch the dominant eye, creating the necessity to utilize the non-dominant eye. So start with just 5 minutes and then work up to 20 minutes by patching. Juliana, thank you. Misty, thank you. Very informative. Kim, great, thanks. Okay. Omar, postural neurology or posturology, great. Angela, thank you so much for joining us. Okay, great webinar. All right, guys, somebody requested to see the slide on dynamic movements. I'm just going to open that up one more time. Okay, so this is the dynamic motor movement slide. Somebody was asking to see that again. So again, you start the dynamic motor pattern in the motor cortex, and then it descends and crosses over in the brainstem, and then descends the spinal cord down to the the skeletal muscle. So if you want to move the right side of your body voluntarily, that's your left motor cortex. And if you want to move the left side of your body, you utilize the right motor cortex. Now, keep in mind that voluntary movement is contralateral, whereas postural stabilization is ipsilateral. So I know somebody had requested to see that, so I'm just leaving that up right there. And again, as we conclude the webinar today, I want to invite you guys to join us for the other 2 webinars that we have coming up, and also stay connected with us with postural neurology. We want to provide you with those neurologic solutions to help your patients instantly. I mean, you guys were seeing people commenting saying, I'm going to use this with a patient right now, or I'm going to implement this afternoon. That's exactly what we want. We don't want this to be over your head. We want it to be directly applicable to the patients who come in every single day. In addition to that, take these same concepts and use it for your complex patients. Parkinson's, special needs, cerebral palsy, you guys were asking those questions. So in order to utilize this information, be sure to start utilizing it all 3 of the webinars, and you're going to get an email follow-up with a certification as proof of as a continuing education. Okay, so thanks for joining, Omar. Good, I'm glad you saw that slide. All right, guys, we're going to wrap it up there. Again, join us in the Postural Neurology Facebook group for ongoing communication and interaction, providing you with the tools that you need. And if you ever have one other thing too is I like to keep it very clinical, our conversation in the Postural Neurology Facebook group. So be sure and post any questions that you have. If you have a patient that comes in this afternoon and you're wondering what you saw and how to interpret it, just ask. If you ask in the Facebook group, then that's a great learning moment, because if you have that question, somebody else does too. We want to be able to answer your questions in a way that provides value to you and then provides more higher value to your patients. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the patient. Postural neurology, you can stop guessing and start knowing. It's all about posture by design and not by circumstance. Thanks for joining in.